The Lucky Star Auto Shop sat on the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, its weathered sign glowing softly in the early morning light. The small town of Millbrook had seen better days, but this garage remained a constant, serving the community faithfully for over 3 decades. Inside, Marco Rivera worked methodically on a classic Mustang, his skilled hands moving with practiced precision. At 35, Marco had earned a reputation as one of the best mechanics in the state, though few knew his true identity as Special Agent Marco Rivera of the FBI's Criminal Enterprise Division. The bell above the shop door chimed, and heavy footsteps echoed through the garage. Officer James Peterson strode in, his uniform pressed and badge gleaming, but his face twisted in a sneer as he surveyed the workspace. Peterson had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years, and his reputation for throwing his weight around was well known throughout the small town. "Hey, you there?" Peterson called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "I need someone to look at my cruiser. Now." Marco slid out from under the Mustang, wiping his hands on a shop rag. His plain clothes and work-stained coveralls concealed both his athletic build and his years of federal law enforcement training. "Good morning, officer," he said calmly. "I'm just finishing up with this vehicle. If you'd like to leave your cruiser, I can take a look at it in about an hour." Peterson's face reddened. "Maybe you don't understand. I'm a police officer, and my cruiser needs immediate attention. Whatever you're working on can wait." Marco stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I understand completely, sir. However, I have a customer's car that I promised to finish by noon. I'd be happy to help you once I'm done." "Listen here." Peterson stepped closer, his hand resting deliberately on his belt near his weapon. "I don't think you know how things work in this town. When an officer needs something, it takes priority. Or maybe you'd prefer we start taking a closer look at your business permits." The threat hung in the air, heavy and explicit. Marco noticed other officers gathering outside the shop window, drawn by the commotion. He recognized several of them from the ongoing corruption investigation. His team had been building for the past 6 months. "Is there a problem here?" A new voice cut through the tension. Sarah Chen, Marco's partner in the FBI operation, appeared in the doorway. She wore casual clothes that masked her federal agent status, playing the role of a customer. Peterson barely glanced at her. "This is none of your business, ma'am. This is between me and the mechanic here." "Actually," Sarah said, pulling out her badge, "I think it is my business. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen." Peterson's face went slack with shock, but he quickly recovered, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Anyone can buy a fake badge these days." "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Officer Peterson," Marco said quietly, his own FBI credentials now visible in his hand. "Special Agent Marco Rivera, FBI Criminal Enterprise Division. We've been investigating corruption in the Millbrook Police Department for the past 6 months. Your behavior today has been illuminating." The color drained from Peterson's face as the implications sank in. Outside, other officers began to disperse, suddenly very interested in being elsewhere. The investigation had already gathered substantial evidence of protection rackets, kickbacks, and abuse of power within the department. Peterson's attempted intimidation of what he thought was a vulnerable business owner had just become the latest piece of evidence. "This is a misunderstanding," Peterson stammered, his earlier arrogance evaporating. "I was just trying to get my cruiser fixed." "By threatening to abuse your authority?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. "By implying you'd harass a legitimate business owner if he didn't give you preferential treatment? That kind of misunderstanding?" Marco stepped forward, his professional demeanor unchanged. "Officer Peterson, we'll be adding this incident to our report. I suggest you leave now. Your cruiser can wait." As Peterson hurried out of the shop, his face burning with humiliation, Marco and Sarah exchanged knowing looks. The encounter would prove valuable in their ongoing investigation, another example of the systemic issues they were working to address. The story spread quickly through the small town. Within days, videos from the shop's security cameras appeared online, showing Peterson's intimidation attempt and the revelation of Marco's true identity. The footage went viral, sparking discussions about police accountability and abuse of power. As for Officer Peterson, he resigned from the force rather than face internal affairs investigation. The last anyone heard, he had moved to another state, his dreams of building a small-town fiefdom shattered by the mechanic he had tried to bully. The mechanic who turned out to be so much more than he appeared. 3 days after the confrontation with Officer Peterson, Marco Rivera stood in the cramped back office of Lucky Star Auto Shop, surrounded by carefully organized evidence files hidden behind false panels in the walls. The small space had become command central for the FBI's investigation into Millbrook's police corruption, with every invoice and repair log concealing notes about illegal activities. Sarah Chen sat at the desk, reviewing footage from their hidden cameras. Peterson started talking, she said, not looking up from her laptop. He's worried about what we might have on him, and he's offering to give up information on Captain Reynolds. Marco leaned against the wall, wiping lingering engine grease from his hands. Reynolds is the key. We've tracked at least 6 different protection rackets back to him, but nothing concrete enough for charges yet. The shop's bell chimed, and Marco quickly moved to the garage, resuming his role as mechanic. A sleek black SUV pulled into the bay, its driver none other than Captain Thomas Reynolds himself. The police captain stepped out, his grey hair perfectly combed, his uniform immaculate. Unlike Peterson's obvious brutishness, Reynolds carried himself with sophisticated authority. "Mr. Rivera," Reynolds smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about that unfortunate incident with Officer Peterson. I wanted to personally apologize for his behavior." Marco wiped his hands on a shop rag, studying Reynolds carefully. "No apology necessary, Captain. These things happen." "Indeed they do," Reynolds agreed, walking slowly around the garage, examining the tools and equipment. "You know, I've been hearing interesting things about you, Mr. Rivera, a mechanic of your skill level, setting up shop in a small town like Millbrook. It's unusual." "I like the quiet life," Marco replied, noting how Reynolds's hand casually brushed against various surfaces, leaving behind small listening devices. The FBI had swept for bugs just that morning, making this attempt at surveillance particularly interesting. "The quiet life," Reynolds repeated thoughtfully. "Yet you've managed to attract quite a bit of attention lately. Videos going viral, media. Inquiries, not very quiet at all. The implied threat hung in the air between them." Marco maintained his calm demeanor, but his mind raced, analyzing every word and gesture. Reynolds wasn't here just to plant bugs. He was here to assess the threat Marco posed to his operation. "Sometimes attention finds you whether you want it or not," Marco said, moving to work on a nearby engine. "All I can do is focus on my work and hope things quiet down." Reynolds nodded, his smile tightening. "That's very wise, though I should warn you, attention can be dangerous in a small town like this. Accidents happen, businesses burn. It would be a shame if anything happened to this lovely shop of yours." Marco straightened up, meeting Reynolds' gaze directly. In that moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that they were engaged in a dangerous dance, though Reynolds couldn't know just how dangerous it truly was. "Is that a concern for my safety, Captain, or something else?" Marco asked quietly. Reynolds laughed, but his eyes remained cold. "Merely an observation, Mr. Rivera. This town has a certain way of doing things. Those who understand that tend to prosper. Those who don't—" He shrugged eloquently. "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that." After Reynolds left, Sarah emerged from her hiding place in the office. "Got it all on camera," she confirmed. "That's the most direct threat he's made yet." Marco nodded, already processing how this encounter would fit into their broader investigation. Reynolds had just given them exactly what they needed: proof that he was personally involved in intimidating local businesses. What Reynolds couldn't know was that every listening device he'd planted was already compromised, set to feed false information back to the police department. The FBI team had anticipated this move weeks ago, preparing an elaborate deception that would give Reynolds exactly the kind of confidence he needed to make a mistake. As Marco returned to his work on the engines, his mind was already plotting the next phase of their operation. Reynolds' visit had confirmed their suspicions. The corruption went straight to the top, and the captain was getting nervous enough to handle threats personally. The chess game was entering its final stages, and Marco had just caught the king, moving into position. Now it was just a matter of patience, precision, and waiting for Reynolds to make the crucial error that would bring down his entire corrupt empire. The evening air was thick with humidity as Marco worked late at the shop, the rhythmic sound of his tools providing cover for the surveillance equipment, recording every word spoken in Captain Reynolds' office across town. Through carefully placed devices and weeks of patience, they had built a complete picture of the corruption network that stretched through every level of the Millbrook Police Department. A sharp knock at the shop's door interrupted his work. Marco tensed, recognizing Officer Lisa Martinez, one of the few clean cops they'd identified during their investigation. Her face was drawn with worry as she slipped inside. "I shouldn't be here," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "But I couldn't just stay quiet anymore. They're planning something big, and I think someone's going to get hurt." Marco led her to the office, where Sarah was already pulling up recording equipment. Martinez's hands shook as she accepted a cup of coffee, her police uniform wrinkled. "From a long shift. Reynolds has been meeting with some people from out of town," she continued. "They've got something planned for the weekend. I overheard Peterson talking about making sure certain businesses were taken care of if they didn't fall in line." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you get any names?" Martinez shook her head. "Nothing specific, but they kept mentioning Lucky Star. Your shop. They know something's not right here and they're planning to send a message." Marco and Sarah exchanged glances. They had anticipated this possibility, but the timing was crucial. Their evidence against Reynolds was almost complete. They just needed a few more days to document the connections to state-level officials. "There's something else," Martinez added, her voice dropping lower. "Reynolds has a file on you, Marco. He's been digging into your background, and he's not buying the simple mechanic story. He's got someone coming from the state police to run a deep check." Marco nodded slowly. They had prepared for this too, with an elaborate backstory that would hold up to all but the most thorough federal-level scrutiny. But the timing was problematic. If Reynolds moved against the shop before they could complete their documentation, months of work could be compromised. "Thank you for telling us," Marco said quietly. "But you should go. It's not safe for you to be seen here." After Martinez left, Sarah pulled up their surveillance feeds. "We've got movement at Reynolds' house, multiple vehicles arriving." Marco watched the screens as several expensive cars pulled into the police captain's driveway. "State-level players," he noted, recognizing some of the license plates from their investigation files. "They're moving faster than we expected." "We need to accelerate the timeline," Sarah agreed, already reaching for her secure phone to contact their FBI support team. "If they're meeting tonight, this might be our best chance to get them all in one place." The next few hours were a blur of activity, carefully hidden from the outside world. To anyone watching the shop, Marco appeared to be working late on repairs. But beneath this calm exterior, an elaborate FBI operation was spinning into motion. Hidden cameras captured every person entering Reynolds' house, while directional microphones recorded the damning conversations within. State officials, corrupt police officers, and local business owners involved in the protection rackets. They were all gathering, unknowingly providing federal agents with everything needed to bring down the entire network. As midnight approached, Marco received an urgent signal from their surveillance team. Reynolds and his associates were on the move, heading toward Lucky Star Auto Shop. The moment of confrontation they'd been both preparing for and hoping to avoid was about to arrive ahead of schedule. "Time to improvise," Marco muttered, quickly, switching on additional hidden cameras and preparing for whatever was about to unfold. Sarah positioned herself in the hidden office space, coordinating with FBI tactical teams now quietly moving into position around the neighborhood. The sound of multiple vehicles pulling up outside broke the night's silence. Marco continued working on an engine, his hands steady despite the tension coursing through his body. The shop's door opened, and footsteps, many footsteps, echoed through the garage. Captain Reynolds led the group, flanked by Peterson and several state-level officials Marco recognized from their surveillance photos. The moment of truth had arrived, months of careful investigation culminating in this unexpected midnight confrontation. The fluorescent lights of Lucky Star Auto Shop cast harsh shadows across the faces of the men who had just entered. Captain Reynolds stood at the front of the group, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled from what had clearly been an intense strategy session at his house. "Working late, Mr. Rivera?" Reynolds' voice carried a dangerous edge. "Or should I say, well, that's the interesting question, isn't it? Who are you, really?" Marco straightened up from the engine he'd been working on, cataloguing the faces around him. Besides Reynolds and Peterson, he recognized State Police Commissioner Wagner and 3 prominent business owners from neighboring counties. Each of them was implicated in the corruption his team had been documenting. "I'm just a mechanic trying to finish up some work," Marco replied calmly, though his mind was racing through contingency plans. The FBI tactical team was in position outside, but any confrontation risked destroying months of careful evidence gathering. Commissioner Wagner stepped forward, his expensive suit out of place in the oil-stained garage. "Cut the act. We've had our people dig into your background. Your documentation is good, too good. The kind of good that makes people like us suspicious." "Marco Rivera doesn't exist," Reynolds added, his composure cracking slightly. "At least, not before 3 years ago. So why don't you tell us who you really are and what federal agency you're working for?" Marco's hand tensed on the wrench he was holding, not in fear, but in preparation. The garage had been carefully arranged over months, every tool and piece of equipment positioned for strategic advantage if things went wrong. "Interesting theory," Marco said, moving casually toward a workbench. "But if you're so convinced I'm a federal agent, showing up here in the middle of the night seems like a risky move." Peterson laughed nervously. "We've got the place surrounded. Your phones are jammed. If you're thinking about calling for backup, don't bother." Marco allowed himself a small smile. "You seem very confident for someone who's already been caught threatening a business owner on camera once before." The reminder of Peterson's earlier humiliation caused the officer to step forward aggressively, but Reynolds held him back. The captain's eyes narrowed as he studied Marco more carefully. "Here's what's going to happen," Reynolds said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're going to tell us exactly who you are and what agency you're working for. Then we're going to have a civilized conversation about mutual benefits and understandings. If you cooperate, this all goes away. If not," he gestured to the men around him, "well, accidents happen in auto shops all the time." Marco set down his wrench, noting how the movement drew everyone's attention. In that split second of distraction, Sarah Chen emerged from the shadows of the office, her FBI badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Actually, Captain Reynolds," she said clearly, "I think it's time we had a different conversation. One about RICO charges, corruption, and the extensive evidence we've gathered over the past 6 months." The garage erupted into chaos. Peterson reached for his weapon, only to find himself facing the business end of Marco's expertly drawn sidearm. Through the windows, the flash of police lights suddenly illuminated the scene as FBI tactical teams moved in from all directions. federal. Agents! Multiple voices shouted as doors burst open and armed officers flooded the space. Hands! Where we can see them! Reynolds' face contorted with rage as he realized the depth of the trap they'd walked into. Every word of their threats had been recorded, their midnight raid documented from multiple angles, even their own surveillance. Devices planted earlier in the shop had been turned against them, recording their planning sessions and incriminating conversations. You son of a... Reynolds lunged toward Marco, but was quickly tackled by FBI agents. The commissioner and other officials raised their hands, their arrogance replaced by shocked resignation as they were systematically cuffed and read their rights. As the suspects were led out to waiting vehicles, Marco and Sarah watched from their garage entrance. The operation had ended differently than planned, but the result was the same. Months of evidence gathering combined with the night's recorded threats would dismantle one of the most entrenched corruption networks in the state. Not bad for a simple mechanic, Sarah commented with a slight smile. Marco looked around at the shop that had been his cover and had somehow become a genuine second home. You know, he said thoughtfully, I might just keep this place running. Even after the case is closed, there's something satisfying about fixing things, cars or corrupt police departments. The lights of emergency vehicles painted the street in rotating colors of red and blue as local news vans began arriving, drawn by the commotion. The story would break with the morning news. A sophisticated FBI operation run from a small-town auto shop, bringing down a corrupt police department that had terrorized the community for years. But for now, Marco simply picked up his wrench and returned to the Mustang he'd been working on. After all, he had promised the owner it would be. Ready by morning, and FBI agent or not, he intended to keep that promise. The morning after the raid, Lucky Star Auto Shop buzzed with a different kind of energy. FBI evidence teams moved methodically through the space, documenting everything while local news crews gathered outside. Marco stood by his workbench, now, dressed in a crisp FBI windbreaker rather than his usual mechanic's coveralls, watching as years of corruption were finally exposed to daylight. Sarah approached, holding up her phone. It's gone national. Every major network is picking up the story. FBI agent poses as mechanic to expose police corruption. Your cover identity just became very public, very fast. The shop's door chimed as Adrian Santos, their FBI team supervisor, walked in. Unlike Marco and Sarah, who had been deep undercover, Adrian had coordinated the operation from the outside, maintaining their connection to the Bureau while they gathered evidence. Outstanding work, both of you, Adrian said, his expression serious. But we've got complications. State Senator Williams was just picked up trying to board a private flight to Mexico. His phone records show multiple calls to Reynolds over the past week. Marco's eyes narrowed. They had suspected political connections, but a state senator's direct involvement elevated the case significantly. How high does this go? We're still mapping it out, Adrian replied, spreading files across a clean workbench. But Reynolds wasn't just running a local protection racket. This was a hub for a multi-state operation. Corrupt officials, drug trafficking, money laundering, all filtering through Millbrook because nobody would look twice at a small town like this. Sarah pulled up surveillance photos on her laptop. Look at these meetings from last month. That's not just local business owners being shaken down. Those are representatives from major criminal enterprises, using Millbrook's corrupt police department as cover for their operations. The implications were staggering. What had started as an investigation into local police corruption had uncovered a sophisticated criminal network that reached into state politics and beyond. Marco thought back to all the seemingly routine interactions he'd had while maintaining his cover as a mechanic. How many of those ordinary citizens had been caught in this web of corruption? A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the shop windows, They could see Officer Lisa Martinez being escorted to a waiting FBI vehicle, her face set in grim determination. As one of the few clean cops who had helped their investigation, she was now being moved to protective custody. "They're already making threats," Adrian explained, catching Marco's concerned look. "Martinez's cooperation helped break this case open. We need to ensure her safety before this goes to trial." Marco nodded, feeling a deep respect for the officers. "Courage. What about the other honest cops we identified? There were a few who suspected something was wrong, but were too afraid to speak up." "We're vetting them now," Sarah said, scrolling through personnel files. "The department will need to be rebuilt from the ground up. We're thinking some of them could form the core of a new, clean force." The shop's phone rang. It had been ringing all morning with customers wondering about their vehicles. Despite everything else happening, Marco had insisted on ensuring all the legitimate repair work was properly handled. His cover identity might have been blown, but he felt a responsibility to the community members who had trusted him with their vehicles. "I'll get it," Sarah offered, reaching for the phone. She paused, hand hovering over the receiver. "You know, you've built something real here. The Bureau would understand if you wanted to maintain some connection to the shop, even after this case is closed." Marco ran his hand along a familiar wrench, remembering all the hours he'd spent actually working on cars, finding an unexpected peace in the honest work of fixing things. "Let's focus on breaking open this conspiracy first. But, yeah, maybe this place doesn't have to completely disappear." Adrian's phone buzzed with an urgent alert. "We've got movement. Reynolds' contacts in the state police are starting to panic. They're shredding documents at 3 different precincts." "Too late for that," Sarah smiled grimly, turning her laptop to show them live surveillance feeds. "We've had their systems mirrored for weeks. Every deleted file, every shredded document, we've got it all backed up." Marco moved to the shop's entrance, watching as more FBI vehicles arrived. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, marking the beginning of what would be a very long day. The case was blowing up faster and bigger than any of them had anticipated, but they were ready. This small auto shop had become ground zero for exposing a corruption scandal that would shake law enforcement across multiple states. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, Marco couldn't help but appreciate the irony. State Senator Williams sat in an FBI interrogation room, his expensive suit wrinkled from his attempted flight and subsequent arrest. Across from him, Marco and Sarah watched as the politician's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of their evidence. "You don't understand," Williams insisted, his voice hoarse. "Reynolds wasn't just some corrupt cop. He was the gatekeeper. Do you have any idea how many people depended on Millbrook staying exactly as it was?" Sarah slid photographs across the table. Surveillance shots showing Williams meeting with known criminal figures at Reynolds' house. "We understand perfectly, Senator. Millbrook wasn't just a corrupt police department. It was a clearinghouse for criminal operations across 3 states. Marco leaned forward, his FBI badge now prominently displayed. "The question is, how much time do you want to serve? Because right now, we're looking at RICO charges that will keep you in federal prison well past your retirement age." Williams's eyes darted between them, the full impact of his situation finally sinking in. "If I talk, if I give you everything, there are people who need to be protected. Good people who got caught up in this without understanding what it really was. Like Officer Martinez." Marco's voice carried an edge of steel. "One of the few clean cops who was brave enough to stand up, and now she's in protective custody." "Because your friends tried to silence her?" The senator slumped in his chair, decades of political arrogance draining away. "You don't fight something this big. You either play along or you get crushed. That's how it's always been." "Not anymore," Sarah stated firmly, pulling out a recording device. "Start from the beginning. We want every name, every connection, every operation that used Millbrook as cover." As Williams began to talk, the scope of the corruption became clear. The protection rackets and local intimidation were just the surface. Beneath that lay a sophisticated network of money laundering, drug trafficking, and political corruption that had turned Millbrook into a perfect hiding spot. A small town where criminals could operate in plain sight, protected by badges and political influence. Meanwhile, across town, Adrian coordinated with FBI tactical teams as they executed simultaneous raids on multiple locations. Evidence gathered from Marco's time undercover had provided them with a complete map of the criminal enterprise, and they were dismantling it piece by piece. The shop's phone rang again. This time it was Rachel Kim, their tech specialist, calling from the mobile command center. "You need to see this," she said urgently. "We've cracked Reynolds' encrypted files. There's a list of judges, prosecutors, even federal agents who were on his payroll." Marco exchanged glances with Sarah as they left the interrogation room. This case wasn't just exposing corrupt cops anymore. It was revealing how deep corruption could root itself in the system when good people looked the other way. Back at Lucky Star Auto Shop, now transformed into an FBI command post, the team gathered to process the new information. Maps and photographs covered the walls where tool posters had once hung. The garage lift now held evidence boxes instead of cars. "Look at these financial transfers," Rachel pointed to her screen. "Every time Reynolds shut down an investigation or buried evidence, money moved through a series of shell companies. But here's the clever part. They used the auto shop's legitimate business model as inspiration. They were fixing problems, charging repair fees that were actually bribes." Adrian studied the data. They built a parallel economy right under everyone's nose, every corrupt action disguised as a legitimate business transaction. No wonder it took an actual mechanic to spot the pattern. The sound of helicopters drew their attention outside, where news crews were setting up for another day of coverage. The story had captured national attention, not just for its scope, but for its methodology. How an FBI agent's mastery of auto repair had provided the perfect cover to expose systemic corruption. "We're going to need witness protection for some of these names," Sarah noted, reviewing Williams' confession. "Once this goes public, a lot of powerful people are going to be very motivated to keep their connections hidden." Marco nodded, thinking of Officer Martinez and others who had risked everything to do the right thing. "We protect them all," he said firmly. "Everyone who helped us, everyone who was brave enough to stand up. This only works if we show people they'll be safe when they choose to fight corruption." Rachel's computer pinged with another alert. "We've got movement on Reynolds' offshore accounts. Someone's trying to hide the money trail." "Too late," Marco smiled, remembering all the nights he'd spent logging every suspicious transaction while pretending to work late on cars. "We've got it all documented. Every bribe, every payoff, every corrupt deal. It's over." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the shop windows. Outside, Millbrook was waking up to a new reality, one where the corrupt system that had seemed untouchable was finally being torn down, piece by piece, all because they had underestimated a Filipino mechanic who turned out to be so much more. 1 month after the raids, Lucky Star Auto Shop was slowly returning to its original purpose. Marco stood in the garage, now cleared of FBI equipment, watching as Officer Martinez, soon to be Chief Martinez, interviewed potential officers. "For the rebuilt police department, your background checks are complete," he told her, handing over a thick file. "These candidates are clean. No connections to Reynolds or his network." Martinez nodded, her new role sitting heavily on her shoulders. After the corruption scandal broke, the state had appointed her as interim police chief, tasking her with rebuilding the department from scratch. Her testimony against Reynolds and his conspirators had earned her widespread respect, both from the community and from law enforcement. "It's strange," she said, looking around the garage. "This place became the heart of everything. Bringing down corruption, starting over, rebuilding trust. Seems fitting that we're conducting interviews here." The shop had indeed become a symbol of change in Millbrook. While Marco's FBI role was now public knowledge, he had decided to maintain ownership of the business, hiring experienced mechanics to run day-to-day operations while he split his time between bureau work and overseeing the shop. Sarah entered through the side door, carrying fresh case files. "Senator Williams's testimony is paying off. 3 more arrests this morning, 2 judges and a prosecutor who were helping bury evidence of police misconduct across the state." The bell chimed as David Chen, their technical analyst, rushed in with his laptop. "We've got something big. Remember those encrypted messages we found on Reynolds's phone? They led us to a private server containing records of every corrupt deal going back 15 years. Marco moved to examine the data, his trained eye catching patterns in the corruption that mirrored mechanical systems. Everything connected, each part working to keep the corrupt machine running smoothly. This isn't just about Millbrook anymore. This is evidence of systematic corruption across multiple jurisdictions. The governor just announced a statewide task force, Martinez added, looking up from her phone. They want to use what we uncovered here as a blueprint for investigating other departments. The shop's radio, usually playing soft rock for customers, was tuned to a news station where reporters discussed the ongoing implications of the Millbrook case. The story had sparked a national conversation about police accountability and the importance of community oversight. A familiar rumble of engines drew their attention outside. Peterson, now wearing prison orange, was being transported to the federal courthouse for another day of testimony. His plea deal had required him to provide detailed information about the department's corrupt activities. "He still can't believe it," Sarah remarked, watching the prison transport drive past. "None of them can. Their whole corrupt system brought it down because they couldn't see past their own prejudices." Marco picked up a wrench, the familiar weight grounding him as he considered how far they'd come. They saw what they expected to see, just another minority business owner they could push around. Their bias made them blind. The sound of children's laughter filtered in from outside. A local school group was touring the police station across the street, part of Martinez's new community outreach program. The kids waved excitedly at the shop, having heard the story of the FBI mechanic who helped clean up their town. "We're not done yet," David said, scrolling through more data. "These records implicate officials in at least 2 more counties. The corruption spread like a virus, infecting one department after another." "Then we keep working," Marco replied, setting down the wrench. "We use what we learned here to help other communities stand up to corruption. This shop proved that change is possible, even in places where corruption seems untouchable." Martinez stood, gathering her files. "I should get back to the interviews. We're building something new here, something better. And it all started because an FBI agent decided to learn auto repair." As she left, Marco surveyed the garage that had become so much more than a cover story. Tools hung neatly on walls that had once hidden surveillance equipment. The hydraulic lift, which had been used to search for hidden compartments in corrupt officials' vehicles, now held a minivan waiting for a brake job. Sarah touched his arm gently. "You know, when this assignment first came up, deep cover as a mechanic in a small town, some people thought it was a waste of resources. They couldn't see how auto repair could connect to fighting corruption." Marco smiled, remembering the hundreds of hours he'd spent learning every aspect of car maintenance, building his cover identity with the same precision he used to investigate crimes. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken system is to understand How things work from the ground up. Outside, the sun was setting on another day in Millbrook. The town was different now, healing, rebuilding, moving forward. And in a small auto shop on the corner, the tools of justice came in many forms. Badges and wrenches, evidence files and repair manuals, all working together to keep both cars and communities running smoothly. The federal courthouse hummed with tension as Marco adjusted his tie, no longer playing the role of a simple mechanic. Today marked the beginning of what prosecutors were calling the largest police corruption trial in state history. Captain Reynolds, Officer Peterson, and 12 other defendants sat in the courtroom, their once proud demeanors diminished by prison jumpsuits and shackles. Sarah slipped into the seat beside him, passing him a coffee and speaking in low tones. Senator Williams just finished his testimony in the closed session. His detail about the money laundering operation is devastating. Reynolds looks like he's seen a ghost. From their position in the gallery, Marco could see Reynolds' shoulders, tense as the prosecution prepared their opening statements. The former police captain had aged years in just a few months of detention, his carefully maintained image of authority crumbling under the weight of impending justice. U.S. Attorney Jessica Patel approached the podium, her presence commanding immediate attention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about more than corrupt police officers. It's about a systematic betrayal of public trust that turned an entire town into a criminal enterprise. As Patel began presenting evidence, Marco noticed familiar faces in the courtroom. Local business owners who had been extorted, honest officers who had been intimidated into silence, and community members who had suffered under years of corrupt leadership. Their presence reminded him why this case mattered so much. The prosecution called Special Agent Marco Rivera to the stand, Patel announced. As Marco stood, he caught a glimpse of Reynolds' face, a mixture of hatred and disbelief that the mechanic he had tried to intimidate was now the key witness in his downfall. Taking the oath, Marco began recounting his time undercover. Each detail was meticulously documented. Every threat, every bribe, every instance of abuse of power. The jury listened intently as he described how the corrupt officers had built their criminal empire, using their badges as shields for illegal activities. "And could you describe the events of October 15th? Patel asked, referring to the night Reynolds and his associates had confronted Marco at the shop. "They came to threaten me," Marco testified, his voice steady. "Captain Reynolds, Commissioner Wigner and others, they had discovered inconsistencies in my background and decided to handle it their way, with intimidation and threats of violence." The defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably as Marco played the recordings from that night. The defendants' own voices filled the courtroom, their threats and admissions of guilt echoing off marble walls. During a break in proceedings, Sarah showed Marco updates from Millbrook on her tablet. The Lucky Star Auto Shop had become a symbol of resistance against corruption, with community members leaving flowers and thank you notes at its doors. Officer Martinez, now interim chief, was implementing sweeping reforms in the department. "The ripple effects are spreading," Sarah whispered. 3 other police departments in the state have requested federal oversight. They're worried about similar corruption in their ranks. Back in session, the prosecution presented their financial evidence. Years of protection payments, bribes, and laundered money were laid bare through bank records and surveillance photos. Marco's meticulous documentation of every transaction that passed through the auto shop proved invaluable. "Your Honor," Patel addressed the judge, "we have evidence that Captain Reynolds and his associates used their positions to facilitate drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized crime activities across 3 states. The auto shop surveillance alone documented over 200 instances of criminal conspiracy. Reynolds' attorney attempted to paint the investigation as entrapment, but the evidence was overwhelming. Video after video showed the defendants engaging in corrupt activities without any prompting from Marco or other federal agents. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Marco caught sight of a group of young Filipino-American law enforcement officers in the gallery. They had come to watch the trial, inspired by the story of an undercover agent who had helped expose systemic corruption while challenging stereotypes and prejudice. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. As Marco and Sarah made their way to their vehicle, "Agent Rivera," they called out, "how does it feel to see the corrupt officers finally facing justice?" Marco paused, considering his response carefully. "This case isn't about personal satisfaction," he said finally. "It's about showing that no one is above the law, and that justice can prevail even in places where corruption seems untouchable." The sun was setting over the city as they drove back to the FBI field office. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more evidence, and more steps toward justice. But for now, Marco allowed himself a moment to reflect on how far they'd come. From a suspicious encounter in an auto shop to a landmark federal corruption trial that would change law enforcement in their state forever. 2 weeks into the trial, Marco sat in the FBI field office, reviewing reports from across the state. The exposure of Millbrook's corruption had triggered a cascade of investigations, with officers from other departments coming forward with similar stories of systemic abuse and criminal conspiracy. 3 more departments just requested federal oversight, Sarah announced, dropping a stack of files on his desk. "Seems like every corrupt cop in the state is suddenly worried about mechanics with wrenches." The joke brought a slight smile to Marco's face, but his attention was focused on a particular report. "Look at this pattern," he said, pointing to a map dotted with markers. "Every department that had regular contact with Reynolds shows the same signs: protection rackets, evidence tampering, mysterious budget discrepancies." Adrian Santos entered the office, his expression grave. "We just got word from witness protection. Someone tried to get to Martinez last night. She's safe, but it proves we're hitting the right nerves." The news sobered the room. Despite being in protective custody, the former officers who had chosen to testify were still at risk. The corruption network they were exposing had deep roots and dangerous connections. "There's something else," Adrian continued, pulling up surveillance photos on the main screen. "Remember those shell companies Reynolds used for laundering money? We traced their ownership. Half of them lead back to a private security firm run by former state police officials." Sarah leaned forward, studying the images. "Atlas Security Services. They've got contracts with dozens of police departments across the state. Perfect cover for coordinating corrupt activities. And perfect leverage for keeping honest cops in line," Marco added, remembering conversations he'd overheard. At the shop, any officer who spoke up suddenly found their security clearance questioned or their background check delayed. The investigation had grown far beyond their initial expectations. What started as a probe into one corrupt police department had unveiled a sophisticated network that used law enforcement credentials as a shield for criminal enterprises. A junior agent burst into the office, tablet in hand. "You need to see this. Commissioner Wagner just cut a deal. He's naming names: judges, politicians, business leaders, everyone who helped maintain the corrupt system." The team gathered around the screen, watching as Wagner's testimony sent shockwaves through the state's power structure. One by one, prominent figures who had thought themselves untouchable were being exposed. "It's like watching dominoes fall," Sarah murmured, "each corrupt official trying to save themselves by exposing others. The whole network is unraveling." Marco's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Martinez. Despite the attempt on her life, she was determined to continue reforming the Millbrook Police Department. Her message included a photo of new recruits being sworn in, young officers committed to serving their community with integrity. We're getting requests from police academies, Adrian noted, reviewing his emails. They want to use the Millbrook case as a training example. Several departments are implementing new oversight procedures based on what we uncovered. The impact of their investigation had exceeded anyone's expectations. Beyond the criminal charges and institutional reforms, it was changing how people thought about corruption and accountability in law enforcement. Sarah pulled up news coverage on her laptop. The story had sparked a national conversation about police reform. Other states were launching their own investigations, using the Millbrook case as a blueprint for rooting out systemic corruption. "Check this out," she said, showing Marco a social media trend. More Than a Mechanic was trending, with people sharing stories of standing up to corruption and discrimination in their own communities. As they worked late into the night, mapping connections and processing new evidence, Marco reflected on how it all started. A simple auto shop had become the key to exposing a corrupt system that many had thought was too powerful to challenge. The wall of their office was covered with photos and documents, a visual representation of the corruption network they were dismantling. At its center was a picture of Lucky Star Auto Shop, the unlikely starting point of a revolution in law enforcement accountability. "You know what's ironic?" Sarah said, reviewing Wagner's testimony. "They could have kept their criminal empire going if they hadn't been so arrogant, so quick to judge based on appearances. Their own prejudices brought them down." Marco nodded, thinking of all the times Reynolds and his associates had dismissed him as just another minority business owner they could intimidate. Their bias had made them careless, unable to see the federal agent beneath the mechanic's coveralls. Outside their office, the wheels of justice continued turning. More arrests were being made, more evidence was being uncovered, and more honest officers were finding the courage to speak up. The domino effect they had triggered showed no signs of stopping, as one corrupt system after another began to fall. 1 month into the trial, the landscape of law enforcement across the state was transforming. Marco stood at the podium in the police academy's main lecture hall, addressing a room full of cadets eager to learn from the Millbrook investigation. "The biggest threat to justice isn't always obvious criminals," he explained, clicking through slides showing Reynolds and his associates. "Sometimes it's the slow corruption of power, the gradual acceptance of small compromises that lead to bigger ones." The cadets took notes intently as Marco shared details of how the corruption had spread through Millbrook's police department. Each example highlighted not just the criminal activities, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue unchecked. Sarah sat in the back of the room, monitoring messages about ongoing investigations. The domino effect of their case had led to probes in multiple jurisdictions, with more officers coming forward every day to report corruption. "Questions?" Marco asked, concluding his presentation. A young Filipino-American cadet raised his hand. "Sir, how did you maintain your cover when faced with discrimination? How did you turn their prejudices into an advantage?" The question struck at the heart of what made the operation successful. Their assumptions about me, about what a Filipino mechanic could or couldn't be, created blind spots. They saw what they expected to see, and that made them vulnerable. After the lecture, Marco and Sarah met with Adrian in the Academy Director's office. The walls were covered with new training protocols developed from lessons learned in the Millbrook case. "The reforms are taking hold," Adrian reported, reviewing the latest statistics. "Complaint investigations are up 300%, but actual incidents of misconduct are down. Officers are policing themselves more effectively." Sarah pulled up a map on her tablet. "Look at the spread. Every department that implements these reforms shows improved community relations and higher arrest rates for actual crimes, not just harassment of minorities." The academy director, a veteran officer named Rodriguez, joined them. "Your case changed everything. We're completely revamping our training programs. Cultural sensitivity isn't just a checkbox anymore. It's fundamental to effective law enforcement." Marco's phone buzzed with updates from Millbrook. Under Chief Martinez's leadership, the department had become a model for reform. Community trust was rebuilding, and crime rates were dropping as residents felt more comfortable working with police. "The real change," Marco noted, "is in the mindset. Officers are learning that their authority comes from public trust, not just their badge." They walked through the academy halls, passing training rooms where cadets practiced scenarios based on actual corruption cases. The Millbrook investigation had provided a wealth of teaching material about both what to watch for and how to resist. Pressure to participate in corrupt activities. "There's something else," Adrian said as they reached their car. "The FBI is expanding the undercover program based on your success. More agents embedding in communities, building real connections, while watching for corruption." The implications were significant. The Bureau was learning from their experience, recognizing that sometimes the best way to expose corruption was to become part of the community being victimized by it. Back at Lucky Star Auto Shop, now officially a front for ongoing FBI operations, Marco checked in with the mechanics he'd hired to maintain the business's legitimate operations. The shop had become both a symbol of resistance against corruption and a practical example of community-oriented law enforcement. "It's not just about catching bad cops anymore," Sarah observed, watching customers interact naturally with both mechanics and undercover agents. "It's about changing the whole relationship between law enforcement and the community." A group of local business owners had gathered in the shop's office, part of a new community oversight committee. They were reviewing police conduct reports, ensuring transparency and accountability in their reformed department. "You know what's really changing," Marco said, picking up a wrench and helping one of the mechanics with a difficult repair. "The assumption that you have to choose between effective law enforcement and civil rights. We're proving you can have both." Outside, new recruits from the academy were conducting community outreach, learning to build relationships with the people they would serve. The sight of uniformed officers chatting comfortably with residents of all backgrounds marked a dramatic shift from the fear and distrust that had once characterized police-community relations. The sun was setting on another day of transformation, casting long shadows through the shop windows. Marco watched as a young officer helped an elderly Filipino woman with her car troubles, speaking to her with respect and patience. "This is how it should be," he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "This is what real law enforcement looks like." The lessons of Millbrook were spreading, changing not just how police departments operated, but how they saw themselves and their role in society. And it all started because someone underestimated a Filipino mechanic who refused to be intimidated by a corrupt system. The tension in the federal courthouse was palpable as the jury filed in after 3 days of deliberation. Marco sat with Sarah and Adrian in the crowded gallery, watching as Reynolds and his co-defendants stood to hear their fate. The culmination of months of undercover work, countless hours of surveillance, and weeks of testimony had led to this moment. In the matter of United States versus Reynolds et al., the jury forewoman began, her voice steady. "On the count of conspiracy to commit racketeering under the RICO Act, we find the defendant, Thomas Reynolds, guilty." The verdicts continued, count after count, defendant after defendant. Guilty for corruption, guilty for witness intimidation, guilty for money laundering. The list of convictions painted a comprehensive picture of how thoroughly they had corrupted their positions of authority. Peterson, who had started this all by trying to intimidate what he thought was a simple mechanic, slumped in his chair as his own guilty verdicts were read. His face showed the dawning realization of how his prejudices and abuse of power had led to his downfall. Reynolds maintained his rigid posture, but his complexion grew paler with each guilty verdict. The man who had once ruled Millbrook's police department like a personal fiefdom was watching his empire crumble around him. Commissioner Wagner, who had taken a plea deal earlier, sat in a separate section, having testified against his former colleagues. His cooperation had helped seal the case, providing crucial details about the corruption network's political connections. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Community members, reform advocates, and police officers from departments across the state. The verdict was being broadcast live, and cheers erupted with each announcement of guilt. Sarah leaned close to Marco, whispering, "Look at the front row." There sat Officer Martinez, now Chief Martinez, surrounded by her new command staff, young officers committed to reforming the department. Her presence was a testament to the changes already taking root in Millbrook. The jury has found the defendants guilty on all 147 counts, the judge announced, his voice carrying authority through the hushed courtroom. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. The defendants are remanded to custody. As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Marco for a moment. The hatred there had been replaced by something else. Perhaps the final recognition that his own arrogance, his assumption that a Filipino mechanic could be easily intimidated, had been his undoing. U.S. Attorney Patel addressed the media on the courthouse steps. This case represents more than just individual criminals being brought to justice. It represents a turning point in how we address systemic corruption in law enforcement. The Millbrook investigation has provided a blueprint for identifying and prosecuting corrupt officials who abuse their authority. Marco stood slightly behind her, still uncomfortable with the publicity, but understanding its importance. His role as both mechanic and FBI agent had captured public imagination, becoming a symbol of how prejudice and corruption could be overcome. "Agent Rivera," a reporter called out, "what message does this verdict send to other corrupt officials?" Marco stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "It sends the message that no one is above the law. That authority comes with responsibility, and those who abuse it will be held accountable." Back at the FBI field office, the team gathered to process the impact of their victory. Maps and charts covering the walls showed the expanding influence of their investigation. Other departments under scrutiny, reform initiatives being implemented, corrupt networks being exposed. "Final tally," Sarah announced, reviewing the verdicts. 23 convictions total, including Reynolds and his immediate circle. 46 cooperating witnesses from 12 different police departments. Over 200 charges successfully prosecuted. This is the biggest police corruption case in state history. Adrian pulled up the latest reports on his tablet. The ripple effects are still spreading. 5 more departments have requested federal oversight. Police unions are implementing new accountability measures. The state legislature is drafting reform bills based on evidence from our investigation. Marco's phone buzzed with messages of congratulation from across the law enforcement community, but the one that caught his eye was from the elderly Filipino woman whose car he'd fixed during his first week undercover. A simple thank you for helping change their town for the better. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said, reviewing community impact statements. "Reports of police misconduct in Millbrook are down 90%. Public trust in law enforcement is at an all-time high. The system really is changing." The team worked late into the night, preparing for the next phase. The convictions were just the beginning. Now came the work of ensuring the reforms took root, that the changes they'd fought for became permanent. Looking out the window at the city lights, Marco thought about the auto shop that had started it all. Lucky Star would continue operating, both as a legitimate business and as a symbol of how justice could wear many faces. "We did it," Sarah said softly, standing beside him. "We really did it." Marco nodded, thinking of all the people who had risked everything to stand up against corruption. We showed them that sometimes the most effective weapon against corruption isn't a badge or a gun. Sometimes it's just a wrench and the courage to stand your ground. The verdict had sent a clear message across the state and beyond. The days of unchecked police corruption were ending, and it had all started because some corrupt officers couldn't see past their own prejudices to recognize that the Filipino mechanic they were trying to intimidate was actually the agent who would bring down their entire corrupt empire. The sentencing hearing drew even more attention than the verdict. 1 month had passed, and the federal courthouse was packed as Judge Miranda Chen prepared to deliver sentences for Reynolds, Peterson, and their co-conspirators. Marco sat in his now familiar spot beside Sarah, both of them dressed in formal FBI attire rather than their undercover gear. "Before I proceed with sentencing," Judge Chen began, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, "I want to address the significance of this case. What happened in Millbrook wasn't just about corrupt officers taking bribes. It was about the systematic abuse of power that eroded the very foundation of justice in our community." Reynolds stood at attention, his prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to the polished uniform he once wore with such arrogance. Behind him, Peterson and the other defendants waited, their former authority stripped away by the weight of their crimes. The evidence presented in this case revealed not just individual acts of corruption, but a culture of abuse that targeted vulnerable communities, Judge Chen continued. Small business owners, minorities, and honest officers who tried to speak up, all were victimized by those sworn to protect them. Marco watched as victims of the corruption stepped forward to deliver impact statements. A Vietnamese restaurant owner described years of extortion. A young black officer recounted how he was threatened into silence. Each story added to the picture of how deeply the corruption had wounded the community. Chief Martinez took the stand, her testimony particularly powerful. These men didn't just break the law, they broke the public's trust. They turned their badges into weapons against the very people they were meant to serve. When it came time for the defendants to speak, most remained silent, but Peterson, perhaps seeking leniency, turned to face the courtroom. "I want to apologize," he began, his voice shaking, "especially to Agent Rivera. My prejudice and abuse of power. I was wrong. I became everything a police officer shouldn't be." Judge Chen listened to all statements before delivering her sentences. "Thomas Reynolds, for your role as the architect of this criminal enterprise, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Officer James Peterson, 20 years. The court further orders that all pension and retirement benefits be forfeited." The sentences continued, each one reflecting the severity of the corruption and its impact on the community. In total, over 300 years of prison time were handed down, along with millions in fines and restitution orders. After the hearing, Marco found himself surrounded by reporters in the courthouse lobby. "Agent Rivera, how do you feel about the sentences?" "Justice isn't about feeling good," he responded thoughtfully. "It's about accountability and change. These sentences send a message, but the real victory is in the reforms happening because of this case." Sarah showed him her tablet, where news was breaking about similar investigations launching in other states. The Millbrook case had become a template for exposing and prosecuting police corruption nationwide. Back at Lucky Star Auto Shop, now officially recognized as both a working garage and an FBI success story, Marco checked in with his mechanics. The shop had become a symbol of community resilience, and he decided to keep it running even after his cover was blown. "You know what's weird?" Sarah said, watching customers interact naturally with the staff. "This place started as just a cover story, but it's become something real, something important to the community." Marco picked up a wrench, the familiar weight grounding him as he considered how far they'd come. Sometimes the best covers aren't really covers at all. They're just different parts of who we are. Adrian arrived with new case files. The FBI was expanding their undercover operations, using the Millbrook investigation as a model for embedding agents in communities vulnerable to corruption. They're calling it the Mechanic Initiative, Adrian explained with a slight smile. Deep cover agents who become real parts of the communities they protect. The Bureau finally realized that sometimes the best way to fight corruption is to build genuine connections. Outside, the sun was setting on Millbrook, a town transformed by the exposure of corruption and the pursuit of justice. The police department, under Chief Martinez's leadership, had become a model of reform and community engagement. Marco watched as a patrol car pulled up, its officer stepping out to chat casually with local residents. No tension, no fear, just the normal interaction between public servants and the community they protected. "We didn't just take down corrupt cops," Sarah observed. "We helped build something better in their place." Marco nodded, thinking of all the changes that had sprung from that first confrontation with Peterson. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of standing up to injustice. The sentencing marked the end of one chapter, but the story of Millbrook's transformation was far from over. The ripples of change continued to spread, touching other departments, other communities, other lives, and it all began because some corrupt officers couldn't see past their prejudices to recognize that the Filipino mechanic they tried to intimidate would be the one to bring their whole corrupt system crashing down. 3 months after the sentencing, Marco sat in FBI Director Thompson's office in Washington, D.C., his success in Millbrook having caught the attention of the Bureau's highest levels. The director, a veteran agent with 4 decades of experience, studied Marco with keen interest. "What you accomplished in Millbrook wasn't just about catching corrupt cops," Thompson said, sliding a folder across his desk. "You showed us a new way to approach deep cover operations. We want to expand on that." Marco opened the folder to find details of police corruption investigations in multiple cities. Each case showed similar patterns to what they'd uncovered. In Millbrook, systematic abuse of power, targeting of minority communities, protection rackets disguised as legitimate police work. "We're creating a new division," Thompson continued. "Specialized teams using your methods, becoming genuine parts of the communities they protect while gathering evidence of corruption. We want you to lead it." Sarah entered the office, having just flown in from Millbrook, where she'd been overseeing the continued implementation of reforms. "The Mechanic Initiative is already generating interest from other federal agencies," she reported. "They're seeing the value of deep community integration in undercover work." Marco studied the case files, recognizing the familiar patterns of corruption and discrimination. "These communities don't just need investigators," he noted. "They need people who understand their struggles, who can build real trust." "Exactly," Thompson agreed. "That's why we're recruiting agents from diverse backgrounds, people who can genuinely connect with vulnerable communities. Your experience as both a mechanic and an agent proved that authenticity is our best tool." The plan was ambitious. Teams of agents would establish themselves in communities across the country, using legitimate businesses as covers while investigating corruption. But unlike traditional undercover operations, they would maintain their community connections even after cases were closed. Lucky Star Auto Shop became more than a cover story, Sarah pointed out. It became a symbol of hope, a proof that standing up to corruption was possible. "We want to replicate that model." Marco thought of the changes he'd witnessed in Millbrook. The Reform Police Department under Chief Martinez, the community oversight committees, the new generation of officers trained to serve rather than intimidate. "There's something else," Thompson added, pulling up a video feed. Police academies nationwide are requesting your input on their training programs. They want to address the cultural biases that allow corruption to take root. The video showed cadets at various academies studying the Millbrook case, learning how prejudice and abuse of power had blinded corrupt officers to the FBI agent in their midst. Marco's story had become a powerful teaching tool about the dangers of discrimination and the importance of community trust. We're not just fighting corruption anymore, Sarah observed. We're changing how law enforcement sees itself and its relationship with the communities it serves. Outside Thompson's window, the Washington Monument stood against the afternoon sky, a reminder of the ideals they were working to protect. Marco thought about how far they'd come from that first confrontation in a small-town auto shop. The new teams will need training, he said, already planning the program. Not just in investigation techniques, but in becoming true parts of their communities. The mechanical skills I learned weren't just for show. They gave me a real way to help people while gathering evidence. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's exactly what we want. Agents who don't just pretend to be part of the community, but who actually contribute to it. The corrupt officers in Millbrook never saw you coming because your cover wasn't an act. It was another facet of who you are. Sarah pulled up maps showing their planned operations. We've identified 20 initial locations where corruption patterns suggest the need for long-term undercover presence. Each team will establish legitimate businesses that serve real community needs. Auto shops? Marco asked with a slight smile. Among others, Thompson replied. Restaurants, repair services, community centers, anything that allows our agents to build genuine connections while monitoring for corruption. The scope of the initiative was unprecedented. It represented a fundamental shift in how the FBI approached corruption investigations, moving from reactive enforcement to proactive community integration. There's one more thing, Sarah added, showing Marco a news alert. Remember Officer Peterson? He's been writing to police academies from prison, asking to share his story as a warning about how prejudice and corruption poison law enforcement. Marco nodded thoughtfully. Even their former adversaries were becoming part of the change they'd started. The ripples from Millbrook continued to spread, touching lives and institutions far beyond that small town. When do we start? He asked, already thinking about how to build and train the new teams. Thompson smiled. We already have. The first group of agents is waiting to meet their new instructor, the mechanic who showed us that sometimes the best way to fight corruption is to become part of the community you're protecting. As they left the director's office, Marco and Sarah passed a wall of FBI historic cases. Soon, the Millbrook investigation would be added there, not just for the corruption it exposed, but for how it transformed the Bureau's approach to community-based law enforcement. 1 year after the Millbrook case, Marco stood in front of Lucky Star Auto Shop, watching as new FBI recruits arrived for their specialized training. The shop had evolved into both a working garage and a training facility for the Bureau's innovative community-based undercover program. Welcome to the Mechanic Initiative, he addressed the group, a diverse mix of agents selected for their ability to connect with vulnerable communities. What you learn here isn't just about maintaining cover identities. It's about becoming genuine parts of the communities you'll protect. Sarah, now co-director of the program, led the recruits through the garage where experienced mechanics worked alongside FBI trainers. The shop's dual identity perfectly embodied the initiative's philosophy, authentic community service, combined with vigilant law enforcement. Your first assignment isn't learning surveillance techniques or evidence gathering, Marco explained, picking up a wrench. It's learning real skills that help real people, whether it's fixing cars, running restaurants, or managing community centers. Your cover story has to be more than just a story. Among the recruits was a young Filipino-American agent who reminded Marco of himself before Millbrook. David Chen had grown up working in his family's restaurant, and now that experience would become part of his toolkit for fighting corruption. "Agent Rivera," Chen asked during a break, "how did you maintain your composure when facing discrimination? When they tried to intimidate you," Marco demonstrated a complex engine repair while answering. "I remembered that their prejudice was their weakness, not mine. Every time they underestimated me because of how I looked or what they thought I was, they revealed more of their corruption." The training program had grown beyond just mechanical skills. Local community leaders, including Chief Martinez, regularly visited to share their perspectives on building trust and recognizing signs of corruption. The old model of undercover work was about deception, Sarah told the recruits. This is about authenticity. Your cover identities should enhance who you are, not replace it. As if to demonstrate her point, a local resident pulled into the shop with car troubles. Marco seamlessly switched from FBI instructor to mechanic, diagnosing the problem while subtly teaching his recruits about community interaction. "Watch how he builds trust," Sarah whispered to the group. "This isn't an act. He's genuinely helping while staying alert for signs of criminal activity. That's what made the Millbrook operation successful." Later that day, they received updates from other mechanic initiative teams across the country. In Chicago, an agent running a family restaurant had uncovered police protection rackets targeting immigrant businesses. In Los Angeles, a team operating a community center had exposed corruption in public housing contracts. "Each success validates our approach," Adrian reported via video conference. "These aren't just investigations anymore. They're transforming how law enforcement interacts with vulnerable communities." Marco worked with Chen on an engine, showing him how mechanical precision mirrored investigative thoroughness. "Every detail matters," he explained, "whether you're fixing a car or building a case against corrupt officials." The shop's phone rang. Chief Martinez calling with news from Millbrook. The reforms they'd implemented had taken root, with community trust in law enforcement at historic highs. Other departments were sending officers to learn from their example. "Remember," Marco told his recruits as the day ended, "our goal isn't just to catch corrupt officers. It's to help build a system where corruption can't flourish, because the bonds between law enforcement and community are too strong to break." Looking around the shop, Marco felt a deep satisfaction. What had started as a cover story had become a model for change, proving that sometimes the most effective way to fight corruption was to become genuinely invested in the communities being protected. Sarah joined him as the recruits left for the day. "Think back to when Peterson first walked in here, trying to intimidate what he thought was just a Filipino mechanic. Could you have imagined all this?" Marco picked up a familiar wrench, the same one he'd held during that first confrontation. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest moments of standing up to injustice. We're not just training agents anymore. We're building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Outside, the sun set on another day at Lucky Star Auto Shop, where the tools of justice came in many forms, and where the next generation of agents was learning that the best way to protect a community was to become genuinely part of it. Isha's legacy of Millbrook lived on, not just in the corrupt system it had exposed, but in the new approach to law enforcement it had inspired, one where authenticity and community connection were the strongest weapons against corruption. 18 months after Millbrook, David Chen stood behind the counter of Golden Dragon, his family's restaurant turned FBI operation in San Francisco's Chinatown. Like Marco before him, Chen had transformed his authentic background into a tool for investigating corruption. The lessons he'd learned at Lucky Star Auto Shop were proving invaluable. "Another health inspector?" Chen's father, in on the operation, asked quietly in Mandarin as Officer Wilson entered the restaurant. "That's the third this month." Chen nodded slightly, recognizing the pattern. Just like in Millbrook, corrupt officers were using regulatory harassment to pressure minority-owned businesses. But this time, they weren't dealing with a helpless restaurant owner. They were facing a trained FBI agent who'd learned from the best. "Mr. Chen," Wilson announced loudly, flashing his badge with unnecessary flourish, "we've had some concerns about your establishment." David played his role perfectly, showing the precise mix of deference and worry that Officer Wilson expected from a young Asian restaurant owner. "Is there a problem, officer? We passed our inspection just last week." "Regulations change." Wilson smirked, already falling into the same trap of prejudice and arrogance that had doomed Reynolds and his crew. "But I'm sure we can work something out." In the kitchen, sophisticated FBI surveillance equipment, disguised as ordinary appliances, recorded everything. Chen's team, including Sarah, who was coordinating from San Francisco's FBI field office, had been building their case methodically. "Agent Rivera's latest report just came in," Sarah's voice whispered through Chen's nearly invisible earpiece. 3 more restaurants in Houston reported similar patterns. "It's not just local anymore. This is coordinated." Chen maintained his cover as Wilson walked through the restaurant, making vague threats disguised as concerns about health code violations. The officers' behavior matched perfectly with what they'd seen in Millbrook. The same tactics, the same abuse of power, the same targeting of minority-owned businesses. Later that evening, Marco himself arrived at Golden Dragon, posing as a restaurant equipment supplier. The meeting had been planned for weeks, allowing him to check on his former trainees' progress while maintaining their covers. "You're doing good work," Marco told Chen as they discussed equipment maintenance in Mandarin, their conversation hidden from potential surveillance by the bustling kitchen noise. "But remember, it's not just about gathering evidence. It's about protecting the community while we build our case." Chen nodded, thinking of all the other restaurant owners in Chinatown who face similar harassment. "We've identified 12 officers involved in the protection racket. But like Millbrook, it goes higher. There's someone in City Hall coordinating the shakedowns." Marco examined some kitchen equipment, using the inspection as cover for their conversation. "The pattern's familiar. They target immigrant businesses because they expect compliance, fear of authority. But they never learn. Their prejudice blinds them to the possibility that the people they're trying to intimidate might be more than what they seem." Sarah's team had mapped out a network of corruption that spanned multiple city departments. Just as Reynolds had used his police authority to run a criminal enterprise, officials in San Francisco were using regulatory powers to extort minority business owners. "The Mechanic Initiative is expanding," Marco updated Chen while pretending to check a refrigerator. 23 operations now active across the country, each one built on the same principle: genuine community integration as the foundation for investigating corruption. Chen's surveillance equipment caught Wilson meeting with other officers in a back alley, discussing which businesses to target next. Their conversation revealed the same arrogant assumption that had proved fatal in Millbrook, that immigrant business owners were easy targets who wouldn't fight back. "When do we move?" Chen asked, thinking of all the families who'd lost their businesses to these corrupt officials. "Soon," Marco assured him. "Just like in Millbrook, we're not just building a case against individual officers. We're exposing the entire system that enables this kind of corruption." As Marco left through the back door, maintaining his cover as a supplier, he felt a deep sense of pride. The young agent he'd trained was carrying forward the lessons of Millbrook, protecting vulnerable communities while gathering evidence of corruption. More importantly, Chen wasn't just playing a role, he was genuinely using his family's restaurant experience to connect with the community he was protecting. The next morning, Chen opened the restaurant early, serving breakfast to elderly residents who'd been sharing their stories of police harassment. Each conversation strengthened his cover while providing valuable intelligence about corruption patterns. "You're like that mechanic in Millbrook," one old woman said in Mandarin, surprising Chen. "The FBI agent who pretended to fix cars, but was really fixing the whole system." Chen smiled, neither confirming nor denying, but appreciating how Marco's story had spread through immigrant communities, offering hope that corruption could be fought successfully. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "Wilson's making his move. He's called a meeting with all the officers involved in the protection racket. Tonight, at the abandoned warehouse on Pier 39, just like in Millbrook, the corrupt officials were about to make a crucial mistake. Their confidence in their power, their assumption that they could intimidate immigrant business owners with impunity, was leading them to become careless. Chen continued serving customers, each movement deliberate and measured. The lessons he'd learned at Lucky Star Auto Shop were about to pay off. Like Marco before him, he would prove that sometimes the most effective weapon against corruption was the very identity corrupt officials tried to dismiss and diminish. The abandoned warehouse on Pier 39 loomed against the San Francisco night sky, its weathered walls concealing a web of corruption about to be exposed. David Chen, now fully embracing his role as Marco's protégé, had spent the past 6 hours meticulously preparing for this moment. FBI tactical teams were hidden throughout the area, their positions carefully chosen to avoid detection. "All units in position." Sarah's voice crackled through secure communications. "Surveillance confirms 12 targets inside, including Wilson and Deputy Commissioner Zhang." Chen adjusted his hidden camera, disguised as a kitchen worker's uniform button. Like Marco had done in Millbrook, he would enter the lion's den appearing vulnerable, while being anything but. The weight of his family's restaurant keyring provided the same grounding comfort that wrenches had given his mentor. "Remember," Marco's voice came through, calm and steady, "they expect to see a scared restaurant owner coming to pay protection money. Their prejudice is their weakness." Wilson had demanded Chen's presence at this late-night meeting, confident that another immigrant business owner would fold under pressure. The corrupt officer had no idea he was walking into an operation modeled on the legendary Millbrook case. Inside the warehouse, Chen found himself facing a scene that could have been pulled directly from Marco's case files. Local officials, corrupt officers, and even some prominent business figures sat around a makeshift conference table, their faces illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. "Mr. Chen," Wilson sneered, gesturing to an empty chair, "so glad you could join us. We're here to discuss the future of business operations in Chinatown." Deputy Commissioner Zhang, who they'd identified as the operations leader, studied Chen with cold eyes. "Your restaurant has been problematic. Refusing to participate in our community protection program is unwise." Chen played his role perfectly, his demeanor crafted from countless hours of training with Marco. "I just want to run my family's business in peace." "Peace comes with a price," Zhang replied, sliding a document across the table. "This lists our requirements: monthly payments, information sharing, cooperation with certain business arrangements. Sign it, and your problems disappear." The document was a goldmine of evidence: explicit demands for bribes, detailed protection racket operations, even names of other officials involved in the scheme. Chen's hidden camera captured everything as he pretended to read through it, with trembling hands. "And if I refuse?" he asked, knowing the response would mirror what Marco had heard in Millbrook. Wilson stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his weapon. "Then maybe we can't guarantee your safety. Chinatown can be dangerous. Accidents happen. Kitchens catch fire." The threats were being broadcast to every FBI agent in position, each word adding to the mountain of evidence they'd accumulated. Chen noticed other business owners around the room, some there voluntarily as part of the corruption, others clearly present under duress. "Think about your family," Zhang added with false concern. Your father worked so hard to build that restaurant. It would be a shame if something happened to it. Chen stood slowly, channeling everything he'd learned from Marco about using their prejudices against them. You're right. I should think about my family. Good choice, Wilson smirked, reaching for the document. That's why I can't let corrupt officers destroy everything they've built, Chen continued, his voice changing as he pulled out his FBI badge. Federal agent, everyone on the ground. The warehouse erupted into chaos as FBI teams breached from all directions. Wilson reached for his weapon but found himself facing the business end of Sarah's sidearm. Zhang attempted to flee but ran straight into a team led by Marco himself. This is impossible, Zhang sputtered as he was cuffed. You're just a restaurant. Oh no, that's exactly what they said to me in Millbrook, Marco replied, securing the commissioner's restraints. You'd think corrupt officers would learn not to underestimate the people they try to intimidate. As the suspects were led away, Chen gathered the terrified business owners who'd been victims of the protection racket. Just as Marco had done with the mechanics in Millbrook, he assured them that their courage in facing corruption would help change the system. Sarah supervised the evidence collection, noting how closely the operation mirrored the Millbrook case. Same playbook, different city, she observed. They never expect the people they're targeting to be the ones who bring them down. Outside, news crews were already gathering, drawn by the sudden law enforcement activity. The story would break with the morning news. Another corrupt network, exposed by the FBI's innovative community-based operation. You did good work, Marco told Chen as they watched the last of the suspects being transported away. You took everything we learned in Millbrook and made it your own. Chen nodded, thinking of all the families who could now run their businesses without fear of corruption and intimidation. I just kept remembering what you taught us. Sometimes the best way to fight corruption is to become genuinely part of the community you're protecting. The sun was rising over San Francisco Bay as the operation concluded, casting golden light across Chinatown's awakening streets. The Golden Dragon restaurant would continue operating, both as a family business and as a symbol of how justice could wear many faces. And somewhere in Millbrook, a mechanic's wrench hung on a wall beside a restaurant keyring, tools of justice that had helped expose corruption by turning prejudice into vulnerability and community connection into strength. 2 days after the San Francisco raids, Marco stood in the FBI's Strategic Operations Center in Washington, D.C., watching as data from across the country painted a picture of widespread corruption being systematically dismantled. Screens displayed active operations in 23 cities, each following the model that had begun in a small-town auto shop. The pattern recognition is remarkable, Sarah noted, highlighting connections between cases. Every corrupt network we've exposed shows the same basic structure, targeting minority businesses, using regulatory powers as weapons, assuming their victims won't fight back. Director Thompson entered the room, followed by a team of analysts. The Mechanic Initiative has exceeded all expectations, he announced, pulling up new statistics. Conviction rates are near perfect. Community trust in law enforcement is rising. We're seeing voluntary reports of corruption from officers who've been inspired by these cases. Marco studied the map of active operations. In Miami, an agent running a bodega had uncovered corruption in immigrant documentation processing. In Detroit, a team operating a halal butcher shop was exposing police protection rackets targeting Muslim businesses. Each operation built on the lessons learned in Millbrook. What's most significant, Sarah added, is how the corrupt officials keep making the same mistakes. Their prejudices blind them to the possibility that the people they're targeting might be federal agents. A video feed connected them to Chen in San Francisco, where the fallout from the Chinatown operation was still unfolding. Deputy Commissioner Zhang is talking, Chen reported. The corruption network extends into state-level agencies. They were using regulatory powers to control immigrant businesses across California. Just like Reynolds' operation grew beyond Millbrook, Marco observed. These aren't isolated cases of corruption. They're systematic attempts to exploit vulnerable communities. The operations center buzzed with activity as new data streamed in. Agent Michelle Park, running a Korean grocery in Los Angeles, had just uncovered links between corrupt officers and international money laundering. Agent James Rodriguez, operating a garage in Houston, modeled directly on Lucky Star, was tracking police involvement in drug trafficking. We're not just catching corrupt officers anymore, Thompson noted. We're changing how law enforcement sees itself and its relationship with minority communities. Sarah pulled up training statistics from police academies nationwide. The Millbrook case study was now required learning, teaching new officers about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of community trust. Marco's story had become a powerful tool for reform. Look at these numbers, she pointed out. Complaints of police harassment in neighborhoods with our undercover operations have dropped by 70%. When corrupt officers can't tell which business owners might be federal agents, they start thinking twice about abuse of power. A secure message arrived from Chief Martinez in Millbrook. She was now consulting with other departments implementing reforms, using her experience to help build bridges between law enforcement and minority communities. The ripple effects continue, Thompson said, reviewing her report. Every corrupt network we expose leads to voluntary reforms in other departments. Officers are coming forward to report misconduct before it takes root. Marco moved to a workstation, examining data from new candidate operations. The Bureau was carefully selecting locations where corruption patterns suggested the need for long-term undercover presence. Each site would get a team of agents trained in both investigation techniques and legitimate business operations. We're expanding the program, Thompson announced. 30 new operations launching next quarter. We want you to oversee the training, Marco. These agents need to understand that success depends on genuine community integration. Sarah brought up personnel files of the new recruits, agents selected not just for their investigative skills, but for their authentic connections to the communities they would serve. Like Chen with his family restaurant experience, each brought unique insights that would enhance their cover identities. Remember what you told me in Millbrook, Sarah asked Marco, about how fixing cars wasn't just a cover story. It was another part of who you are. That's what makes this program work. These aren't just undercover operations. They're genuine community businesses run by agents who understand the people they're protecting. A series of alerts drew their attention back to the main screens. 3 more corruption networks had been exposed in the past hour alone. In Chicago, corrupt officers targeting Polish businesses had walked into an FBI trap. In Atlanta, a protection racket focusing on Latino restaurants had been dismantled. In Boston, agents had uncovered systematic harassment of Vietnamese shop owners. This is more than law enforcement, Marco observed, watching the operations unfold. This is about showing corrupt officials that the communities they target are stronger than they think. Director Thompson nodded in agreement. The Mechanic Initiative is rewriting the book on community-based law enforcement. Every successful operation proves that the best way to fight corruption is to become genuinely invested in the communities being protected. As the day continued, more reports flowed in from across the country. Each success story followed the pattern that had begun in Millbrook. Corrupt officials undone by their own prejudices, brought down by the very people they had underestimated. Sun set over Washington as Marco prepared to brief the next group of agents. Tomorrow, they would begin their training, learning not just investigative techniques, but the importance of authentic community connection. The legacy of a small-town auto shop continued to grow, transforming law enforcement one operation at a time. 2 years to the day after the Millbrook raid, Marco stood once again in Lucky Star Auto Shop. The garage had been transformed into a national training center for the FBI's community-based operations program, while still maintaining its identity as a working auto repair shop. Today, it was hosting a special ceremony that would bring everything full circle. "Welcome to the next phase of the Mechanic Initiative," he addressed the gathered crowd, which included FBI officials, reformed police departments, and community leaders from across the country. "What started here as a single undercover operation has grown into something none of us could have imagined." Sarah stood beside him, now the program's deputy director, while Chief Martinez represented the success of police reform. In the audience sat David Chen, Michelle Park, and other agents who had carried the lessons of Millbrook to cities across America. 2 years ago, Marco continued, corrupt officers walked into this shop, thinking they could intimidate what they saw as just another minority business owner. Their prejudice blinded them to the possibility that the person they were threatening was actually a federal agent investigating their crimes. He gestured to the walls, where tools hung alongside photographs of successful operations. But what made our investigation successful wasn't just good undercover work. It was genuine connection to the community. Every car I fixed, every customer I helped, that wasn't just maintaining cover, it was building trust. The shop's main bay now housed a state-of-the-art training facility, where new agents learned both investigative techniques and practical skills. The hydraulic lift that had once hidden surveillance equipment now served dual purposes, teaching automotive repair and demonstrating evidence-gathering techniques. "Today, we're expanding the program further," Sarah announced. "The Mechanic Initiative is going international. Law enforcement agencies from around the world are adopting our model of community-based investigation." Director Thompson stepped forward to present statistics that showed the program's impact. Corruption investigations had a near-perfect conviction rate. Community trust in law enforcement had risen dramatically. Police departments were implementing reforms voluntarily, eager to prevent the kind of exposure that had happened in Millbrook. But numbers don't tell the whole story," Marco added. "The real success is in the communities we've helped protect. Every immigrant business owner who can operate without fear of extortion. Every minority neighborhood where police serve rather than intimidate. Every officer who chooses integrity over corruption." Chen shared his experience from San Francisco, describing how the lessons learned in Millbrook had helped expose corruption in Chinatown. Other agents followed, each telling similar stories from their operations. Corrupt officials, undone by their own prejudices. Communities empowered to stand against abuse of power. Chief Martinez spoke about the transformation of her department. "Millbrook was once a symbol of corruption," she said. "Now we're a model for reform. Officers come here to learn not just what went wrong, but how to build genuine trust with the communities they serve." The ceremony's highlight was the unveiling of a new training program. Future agents would spend time working in actual community businesses, learning to balance their investigative duties with genuine service to the public. "The corrupt officers who threatened me in this shop thought they were untouchable," Marco reflected. "They never imagined that their actions would lead to a complete transformation of how we approach law enforcement." Sarah presented footage from operations across the country, auto shops, restaurants, grocery stores, and other businesses run by undercover agents who had become genuine parts of their communities. Each success story traced its roots back to the lessons learned in Millbrook. "But our work isn't finished," Marco concluded. "As long as there are corrupt officials who think they can abuse their power, as long as there are communities vulnerable to exploitation, we'll continue expanding this program. The tools of justice come in many forms. Sometimes it's a badge and a gun, sometimes it's a wrench or a spatula." As the ceremony ended, Marco walked through the shop that had started. It all, the familiar smell of oil and metal, reminded him of those first tense days undercover. On the wall hung the wrench he'd held during his first confrontation with corrupt officers, now a symbol of how justice could wear many faces. Outside, new recruits practiced both automotive repairs and surveillance techniques. The next generation of agents was learning that the most effective way to fight corruption wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about becoming genuinely invested in the communities they protected. The sun set on Lucky Star Auto Shop, casting long shadows through the garage doors. What had begun as one agent's cover story had evolved into a movement, transforming law enforcement from within by proving that sometimes the strongest weapon against corruption was the very identity corrupt officials tried to dismiss. 5 years after Millbrook, Marco sat in his office at the FBI Academy in Quantico, reviewing applications for the now legendary Mechanic Initiative. The program had grown beyond anything he could have imagined when he first picked up a wrench. In that small-town auto shop, "You're going to want to see this," Sarah said, entering with a tablet displaying news footage from across the globe. International law enforcement agencies had adopted their model, with success stories pouring in from every continent. In Tokyo, a Korean-Japanese agent running a small electronics shop had exposed police corruption targeting foreign business owners. In London, a Pakistani-British operative managing a curry house had uncovered systematic harassment of immigrant entrepreneurs. Each case followed the blueprint established in Millbrook. "Director Thompson wants us in New York next week," Sarah continued. "The UN is establishing a global task force based on our methodology. They're calling it the Community Integration Response Force." Marco nodded, thinking of how far they'd come. The wrench from Lucky Star Auto Shop now sat in the FBI Museum, alongside artifacts from other groundbreaking operations. But the real legacy wasn't in museums. It was in the transformed relationships between law enforcement and minority communities. Latest. Statistics just came in, Sarah added, pulling up charts. Police corruption cases nationwide have dropped 60% since we started the program. More importantly, voluntary reporting of misconduct by officers has increased by over 200%. A video call connected them with Chen in San Francisco. His family's restaurant had become a West Coast training center for the program, while still serving some of Chinatown's best dim sum. "The change is remarkable," he reported. "Officers who used to shake down businesses now come to community meetings, building real relationships." Chief Martinez joined the call from Millbrook, where she was hosting a delegation of international police officials. The small town that had once symbolized corruption had become a model for reform, its transformed police department leading the way in community-oriented law enforcement. "Remember Peterson?" she asked, referring to the officer whose prejudice had started it all. "He's been released from prison. He's working with police academies now, using his experience to teach cadets about the dangers of bias and abuse of power." The transformation hadn't been easy. Some departments had resisted change, clinging to old ways of operating. But the success of the Mechanic Initiative was undeniable. When officers couldn't tell which business owners might be federal agents, they were forced to treat everyone with respect. "We've got new operations launching next month," Sarah noted, displaying a map dotted with locations. Each one building on what we learned: auto shops, restaurants, grocery stores, community centers, places where agents can become genuine parts of the communities they protect. Marco reviewed files from recent cases. In Miami, an agent running a Cuban cafe had exposed immigration fraud. In Detroit, a team operating a halal market had uncovered systematic discrimination. Each success reinforced the program's core principle: that authentic community connection was the key to fighting corruption. "The next generation is ready," Sarah said, showing profiles of new recruits. Young agents from diverse backgrounds, each bringing unique skills and cultural understanding to their roles. Like Chen with his restaurant experience, they would turn their heritage into a strength. Outside his office window, the FBI Academy grounds bustled with activity as another class of agents trained in the innovative techniques that had begun in a small-town garage. The lessons of Millbrook had become required learning, teaching future law enforcement leaders that sometimes the most effective weapon against corruption was the very identity corrupt officials tried to dismiss. A message arrived from Director Thompson. Congress had approved expanded funding for the program, recognizing its unprecedented success in transforming law enforcement culture. The Mechanic Initiative would continue growing, adapting to new challenges while maintaining its core principle of authentic community integration. You know what still amazes me? Sarah mused, watching training footage from various operations. How something so simple, treating people with respect, becoming genuinely part of the community, could change everything. Marco picked up a wrench from his desk, similar to the one that had started it all. Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones. We just had to prove that being undercover doesn't mean losing your identity. It means embracing it as a strength. The sun set over Quantico as they prepared for the next phase of their mission. The legacy of Lucky Star Auto Shop lived on, not just in successful operations and convicted corrupt officials, but in the transformed relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. It was a legacy built on a simple truth, that justice could wear many faces and that the strongest weapon against corruption was often the very identity corrupt officials tried to dismiss. 10 years after the events in Millbrook, Marco stood once again in Lucky Star Auto Shop, now a national historic landmark and active FBI training facility. The garage where he had once fought corruption alone had become a symbol of transformation. In law enforcement, its impact reaching far beyond that small town. Welcome to the 10th anniversary celebration of the Mechanic Initiative. He addressed a packed crowd that included FBI directors, international law enforcement officials, and community leaders from around the world. A decade ago, corrupt officers walked into this shop thinking they could intimidate what they saw as just another minority business owner. They never imagined their prejudice would lead to a revolution in law enforcement. Sarah, now assistant director of the FBI's Community Integration Division, joined him at the podium. The program they had built from that first undercover operation had expanded beyond their wildest dreams, with over 500 active operations worldwide. The numbers tell an incredible story, she reported. Police corruption cases have dropped 70% nationally. Community trust in law enforcement has reached historic highs. But the real success isn't in statistics. It's in the changed relationships between officers and the communities they serve. David Chen was there, having risen to lead the West Coast division of the program. His family's restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown had become legendary in its own right, training agents while serving authentic cuisine. "We're not just fighting corruption anymore," he explained. "We're building bridges between law enforcement and communities that had lost faith in the system." Chief Martinez, now a senior advisor to the FBI's police reform initiatives, shared her perspective on the transformation. Millbrook was once a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. Now we're a model for how police departments can work with their communities instead of against them. The shop's main bay, still a working garage, displayed photos and artifacts from successful operations around the world. Auto shops, restaurants, grocery stores, community centers, each business run by agents who had become genuine parts of their communities while fighting corruption. The key was authenticity, Marco explained to the gathered crowd. "We proved that being undercover doesn't mean pretending to be something you're not. It means embracing your identity, your heritage, your connection to the community as a strength." Former Officer Peterson, who had completed his prison term and rehabilitation, stood to address the audience. "My prejudice and abuse of power brought me here 10 years ago," he admitted. "But what Agent Rivera and this program taught us is that true law enforcement isn't about power over communities, it's about service to them." Director Thompson announced the next phase of the initiative. "We're expanding beyond corruption investigations. The Mechanic Initiative model is being adapted for counter-terrorism, organized crime, and civil rights enforcement. When agents are genuinely part of the communities they protect, every aspect of law enforcement becomes more effective." Sarah presented footage from recent operations. In Toronto, an agent running a Caribbean restaurant had exposed human trafficking. In Sydney, a team operating an Asian grocery had uncovered money laundering, each success built on the lessons learned in that small-town auto shop. "But our work isn't finished," Marco reminded them. "As long as there are those who would abuse their authority, as long as there are communities vulnerable to exploitation, we'll continue evolving and adapting our methods." The ceremony included the inauguration of the Mechanic Initiative Global Training Center, built around the original Lucky Star Auto Shop. Future agents would learn not just investigative techniques, but the importance of genuine community integration and cultural understanding. As the day drew to a close, Marco found himself alone in the garage bay where it had all started. The tools on the walls were both functional equipment for training and symbols of how justice could wear many faces. The hydraulic lift that had once hidden surveillance equipment now raised vehicles for both repairs and evidence-gathering instruction. Sarah joined him, carrying the wrench he had held during that first confrontation with corrupt officers. "Did you ever imagine, when Peterson walked in that day, that it would lead to all this?" Marco took the wrench, feeling its familiar weight. "Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest moments of standing up to injustice. We didn't just change how we fight corruption, we changed how law enforcement sees itself and its relationship with the communities it serves." The sun set over Quantico as they prepared for the next phase of their mission. The legacy of Lucky Star Auto Shop lived on, not just in successful operations and convicted corrupt officials, but in the transformed relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. It was a legacy built on a simple truth, that justice could wear many faces, and that the strongest weapon against corruption was often the very identity corrupt officials tried to dismiss.